What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to do a little resume review or filmography review of director Sam Raimi. As most of you probably know, his latest film, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, is coming May 6th, which is his first feature film in a good long while. But what I want to start doing with this channel moving forward is anytime a director with a large filmography has something new coming out, especially if they've been fairly inactive as of late, I just want to do a little sentimental journey through their entire career, just as a reminder of all the great things they've accomplished in the past, but also as a way of helping younger film fans discover all these incredible movies from the past. And when it comes to the career of Sam Raimi, I'm particularly emotionally invested because he's one of a handful of directors where I was watching and loving his movies long before I really even knew what a director's job might be or who Sam Raimi was by name. And that short list includes people like John Carpenter or Walter Hill or David Cronenberg. But the way that I first got exposed to Sam Raimi was in the best possible way, where a friend of mine had this kind of cool, kind of hot older sister who was dating this edgy horror freak. And he had done a rough assembly in VHS of his favorite scenes from various horror films. And because this cassette was of such poor quality and so grainy and so staticky and had such crude splicing in between the clips, in a weird way, it almost made Evil Dead feel like this snuff film or movie that should be against the law or banned or whatever. Actually, speaking of which, it was banned outright in the UK for a good long while.
Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if I had remained on those hot coals, burning my pretty flesh. You have pretty skin.
But at age 12 or so, when I first saw these clips, they just wrecked me, and I became completely, totally fascinated because this is one of many movies from the late 70s and early 80s where if you saw it on kind of a grainy VHS cassette, it disguised the low-budget quality and made it seem all the more real and all the more powerful. And then a few years later, my dad and I were channel surfing, and we stumbled into Evil Dead 2, probably about 20 minutes into it. I didn't really know what it was, but slowly but surely throughout middle school, I kind of put two and two together, finally saw Evil Dead 1 and 2 in their entirety, and my fate was sealed. I was a Sam Raimi fan for life. So much so that in high school, a friend of mine who shared my appreciation for those movies, we created what we called the Dead by Dawn Society, which we maintained throughout our junior and senior year. And I was at an all-male rural boarding school with very little to do besides gazing at cows. But every few months, we'd catch a cab into town, rent a few VHS cassettes, go back to this biology lab where they had a TV and VCR all in the same room. And we would just pack in all these teens around this little tiny screen watching Evil Dead 1 and 2. And eventually we added things like Night of the Living Dead. But creating the Dead by Dawn Society was a major highlight of my high school experience. So what I want to do today is go through Sam Raimi's entire career. And obviously we're talking about a giant body of work. So I'm not going to be able to do the deep dive and look under each and every single stone along the way. Luckily, there are tons of interviews out there, tons of documentaries. This is more going to be my personal journey through his filmography throughout basically the majority of my life. And looking back on it as a whole, it's clear that Sam Raimi does his best work when he's getting to work with old friends and siblings. And the big question is, to what degree will the Marvel Cinematic Universe let him do his thing? Because obviously on Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3, those films were wildly successful. A lot of people still regard Spider-Man 2 as one of the best superhero movies ever made. And so Sam Raimi, he's not some young kid fresh out of film school who's made a cool short film or a cool indie movie, and then Marvel's basically snatching them up and grooming them, giving them their first big shot. He's been to the rodeo many times. He's made giant blockbusters. He knows the drill. And the fact that composer Danny Elfman's coming back to do the score for Multiverse of Madness is a really good sign, because I think Danny Elfman's score for the first two Spider-Man movies is one of the most bone-chilling themes that we've ever heard in the context of the superhero genre. And so while my enthusiasm for the MCU might not be what it once was, I'll be rooting for this movie all the way. But no matter what happens with Multiverse of Madness, there's no denying the fact that Sam Raimi's made a lot of great, beloved movies over the years. How many directors can you name who have made a beloved trilogy in two different franchises? We've got 3 Evil Dead movies and 3 Spider-Man movies. That alone puts him in a very rare elite club of filmmakers. And throughout his entire crazy career, there are all these amazing tropes, like obviously the one and only Bruce Campbell, the man who possesses a chin that could kill. They've known each other since high school, and here they are, not very old men, but older men still making movies together. And it's incredible to me just how many friends and family members Sam Raimi has continued to work with throughout his career. I mean, obviously, Rob Tapert is a major contributor, having produced most of his work. He's got his brothers, Ivan and Ted Raimi, with whom he's worked again and again as screenwriters and as actors. And as Sam Raimi's career continued to evolve and he became more polished and became more successful, he continued to attract new collaborators like editor Bob Murawski, who has edited a ton of his movies, going all the way back to Army of Darkness, or composers like Danny Elfman, with whom he's worked many times, or special effects artists like Greg Nicotero. And apart from Bruce Campbell, there are actors like Chelsea Ross, or J.K. Simmons, or Scott Spiegel, or Gary Cole. And so I'll be very curious to see just how many of the old gang is present in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, or will Sam Raimi's old car, the classic, make a cameo like it has in pretty much every movie or show that he's ever made. But I've been talking for a while at this point without really getting into any of the movies, so let's start with It's Murder from 1977. People like to say that Evil Dead is Sam Raimi's first feature film, but It's Murder was made for $2,000 back in college. Is it good? No, it's basically a Knives Out style murder mystery when somebody dies, and it's all about to whom is his vast fortune going to be kind of bequeathed in the will. But if you want to see a baby-faced young Ted Raimi when he's 13, he's a great little maniac. He's totally astonishing. And from the look and feel of it and the makeup style, at any given moment, you kind of feel like demons are just going to erupt. But this is not a horror film. This is a murder comedy mystery. And it's kind of hard to hunt down because it uses a lot of music that they don't have the rights to, music from movies like Psycho and North by Northwest. But if you're a big Sam Raimi fan, you got to see It's Murder to have a full understanding of where he started before diving into his first major experiment, which was raising the money for Evil Dead. And of course, they did it in the best possible way by making a little proof of concept film, Within the Woods, in 1978. And it basically incorporates ingredients from the screenplay of Evil Dead, but for people who don't know, Sam Raimi was 19 or 20 when they started trying to get Evil Dead together, and they were raising money from dentists and local businessmen, basically all these people who had nothing to do with Hollywood. And as a way of proving that they knew what they were doing, they created Within the Woods, and they would sit people down, show them this little movie, and the people that were smart enough to get on board, eventually they ended up seeing a return of roughly 5 times of their initial investment. And in the history of American film, particularly in horror, there's no better tradition than a bunch of kids running off into the woods with a camera and then emerging weeks later with, basically all this raw footage for what will become a classic horror movie. And the examples are many, whether you're talking about George A. Romero in Night of the Living Dead, or Wes Craven in Last House on the Left, or Tobe Hooper in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some of the best horror films ever have been made completely independent of official showbiz. And I have no idea how many times I've seen Evil Dead over the years, but obviously to call it a cult classic would be just the world's biggest understatement. This is a movie that has become officially part of horror DNA. I don't know if there's a shot more iconic in horror than seeing this girl possessed by a demon trying to fight her way out of a cellar, laughing and taunting and jeering. But I could do an entire 3-hour video just about Evil Dead, but you can't discuss Evil Dead without discussing all these incredible special effects and camera techniques that they basically had to invent solutions for, whether that's attaching a camera in the middle of a long board in order to give it a smooth feel, or the way they would rig actors to float up off the ground, or just the way that they all basically froze and suffered their way through that miserable shoot. And how even once they were done filming, Bruce Campbell and Rob Tapert and Sam Raimi kept having to go back to their regular day jobs in order to raise money to finish the movie, because while they shot it for $90,000, they spent a couple $100,000 on it total, because they still had to edit it, they still had to sound mix it, they still had to do marketing, etc. And I'll never forget when I was reading Bruce Campbell's book, If Chins Could Kill, he was talking about how during the making of the movie, no matter how miserable they were, no matter how much they were suffering, he would look at Sam Raimi and always be kind of judging what shade of gray he was becoming on any given day, because nobody was working harder than Sam Raimi on that movie. And that's what it takes to launch a film career, and he's been applying himself with the same energy for the last 40 years ever since. And speaking of His Chins Could Kill, that's definitely worth hunting down because Bruce Campbell shares so many brilliant anecdotes, which I will not rip off and copy here. And over the last few days, I've been listening to hours upon hours of interviews with Sam Raimi as I play Elden Ring. I'm still obsessed with Elden Ring. Many, many weeks after it came out, I think it's one of the best games ever, but that's beside the point. It was my way of pretending like I was getting some work done while playing the game, and I came across this one interview where Sam Raimi offered some really interesting advice to people who want to be filmmakers. And whenever you talk to film historians or cinephiles or whatever you want to call them, they'll always say, oh, well, you got to watch the films by so-and-so, and you've got to read these books, and they have a more kind of rigorous academic approach. Like, you got to learn your Orson Welles, you got to learn your Alfred Hitchcock, you got to learn your Ingmar Bergman, et cetera, and so forth. Sam Raimi had some different advice. While he loves people like Alfred Hitchcock and pays homage to him, his advice was very simple. He said, every single night after you get through with your day job, you need to write all night. And when the weekend comes, you need to shoot something with your friends. You need to get together with actors and actually direct people reading your text. And then every few weeks, cut it together and show it to an audience. At that point, you're now a filmmaker. And I was like, wow, it's really getting right to the heart of it. You can know your film history. You can be someone like Peter Bogdanovich or Martin Scorsese or Quentin Tarantino, where they, love and adore watching movies, or Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut. History is full of great filmmakers who are also big film buffs. But in the end, if you want to be a director, a filmmaker, you got to roll up your sleeves and make some goddamn movies. And you don't necessarily need to wait. You can be a 19, 20-year-old kid and just do it. So yeah, Sam Raimi, I think that might be the best advice I've ever heard for somebody who wants to be a director at some point. Cut out all the bullshit and just start working. But after Evil Dead, we see the beginning of one of the great filmmaking friendships in filmmaking history when Joel Cohen comes on as an assistant editor on Evil Dead. And as I mentioned in my previous video where I did my top 10 Coen Brothers videos, Joel and Ethan Coen and Sam Raimi have been working together off and on for many years, including on Sam Raimi's next movie, Crime Wave from 1985. And this is one of those movies where the less said about it, the better, because Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell and everybody involved, they kind of got in over their head. It was their first experience making a union film. And after the fact, Sam Raimi has distanced himself from the production because he says it's one of his least favorite moments of his career, where it was just a horrible, horrible, depressing experience, where even his editor and his composer got removed by the producers. So if you want to have a complete view of Raimi's career, obviously you need to see Crime Wave, and Bruce Campbell is really funny in it. And there are a few scenes where we get some of those trademark Sam Raimi tropes, like a camera following an object through the air as it's flying towards a target, but it really isn't until his next movie, Evil Dead 2, which he made for Dino De Laurentiis in 1987, that we really see Sam Raimi starting to kind of deliver on that early promise that he showed in Evil Dead. So, Evil Dead 2, I don't even really know how to get going on this movie because there's so much to get into, but I think the best experience I ever had watching Evil Dead 2 was with a couple of friends in high school, where maybe or maybe not some hallucinogenics and mind-altering substances were involved, but we sat down to watch this movie, and I thought people were going to die. They were laughing so hard. I mean, people were losing their minds. That first bit where Bruce Campbell gets basically knocked through the trees, I mean, we had to stop the movie. People were in convulsions. They were laughing so hard. It's such an insane, delirious movie, and maybe the most entertaining work of Bruce Campbell's career. I mean, just little things like when his hand, which he has his epic duel with, gets stuck in a mouse trap, and then Bruce just goes, ha! When he's aiming the shotgun. I don't know why, but everything about this kind of one-man show just makes me shit myself. Or watching him smashing plates on his head and flipping himself over and punching himself in the face. It's an unhinged just act of acting brilliance. And I like how the movie is not really like a sequel, but it's almost like a remake of the first movie, where everything that happens in the first movie kind of gets redone and summed up in the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of Evil Dead 2, and then we get a new story. But my friends and I in high school, we would joke. We would say that the movie takes place a month or two after the first one. And when they're in the car en route to the cabin, and the girl's like, oh, are you sure no one lives up there or nobody's up there? And it's I think so. Basically, we would just joke about how he had forgotten everything that happened in the previous movie, and that he was coming back for more. And I don't know if a central character has ever taken more damage in a single movie than Bruce Campbell in this, whether he's being thrown through stairs or thrown through the woods, or he gets his ass kicked every step of the way. It's just delightful. And then the fact that it ends in medieval times, I mean, oh my God, that just came out of nowhere. I mean, the first time I saw it, my dad and I were like, what the fuck is going on? But of course, the massive payoff would come a few years later with Army of Darkness, but we didn't know that at the time. And I'll never forget seeing the poster for Army of Darkness, like in I think in a Blockbuster or some sort, or maybe it was like a Suncoast like video store. And once again, you have to remember, I was a kid. I wasn't really aware of like who Sam Raimi was or what he was up to. And I remember seeing that poster and seeing that chainsaw in his hand. I was like, oh, Army of Darkness. That must be somehow connected to Evil Dead 2. And then when I finally sat down, I was like, oh, it's a direct sequel. But before we get there, we have to pause for a moment for Sam Raimi's movie Darkman from 1990, which I think still remains one of the great underrated superhero movies of the last 40, 50 years. We live in an era now where you can throw a rock and you'll hit a superhero show or a cartoon or a feature film. I mean, we're drowning in superhero content. But in 1990, that just was not the case. This is before Batman, the animated series. This is long before like Blade, X-Men, and Spider-Man showed how viable superhero movies could be. At this time, there was pretty much Tim Burton's Batman, and for people who were old enough to remember, you had like the Richard Donner Superman. But in 1990, if you were a fan of superheroes, really the only way to express your love of superhero stories was by doing it the old-fashioned way, reading comics. And around the time that Darkman came out, pretty much every comic that you would buy would have a giant ad for Darkman in the back. I was like, what the fuck is Darkman? And I did not see it in a theater. I saw it on VHS. But it's incredible watching it now, seeing just how many tropes and ingredients would become kind of mainstream and popular in later movies. Like, first and foremost, a score by Danny Elfman. Obviously, Danny Elfman's more famous for his scores for people like Tim Burton or scores for movies like Spider-Man. But Darkman is a classic, quintessential origin story for a disfigured superhero. Or you could say, oh, it's more like Phantom of the Opera. But Liam Neeson just hurls himself into the movie. Chet Zar contributes some incredible practical special effects. And another wonderful, beautiful thing about Darkman was that it was not based on any previously existing IP. They actually were creating a new character from nothing, and I wish people would do that more often. We see the recycling of so many classic characters again and again and again, but when you create a new character, you can do whatever the fuck you want, and you can make it as weird and bananas and crazy as you want, and Darkman is weird and crazy as shit, and I love it. And speaking of weird and crazy as shit, Army of Darkness from 1992. I've lost track of how many times I've seen this movie, but it's a lot. And do I like it as much as Evil Dead 2? No, but when I was like 15, 16 years old, that didn't really matter because I thought the whole trilogy, I still think the whole trilogy is just a one-of-a-kind experience because you've got like a real deal horror movie. I don't even know how to describe Evil Dead 2. And then you've got this kind of strange medieval fantasy comedic romp where for years I would quote this movie left and right like, yo, she-bitch, let's go. Or lines like, oh, well, that's just what we call pillow talk, baby. I mean, Bruce Campbell, this is probably his funniest role that I've ever seen. I mean, obviously, Bruce Campbell's been funny as shit in a million things, but Army of Darkness, he is particularly good. And it's with Army of Darkness that I feel like the style of the Evil Dead franchise more or less has finally been kind of like settled and agreed upon, which would eventually lead to Ash versus the Evil Dead. But we're going to get to that at the end of this video because we have a lot of shit to get to before that. But let's talk about 1995's The Quick and the Dead. I think this is a movie that a lot of people have forgotten even exists. But if I were to tell you there's a Western out there starring Gene Hackman and Sharon Stone and Leonardo DiCaprio and Keith David and Lance Henriksen and Woody Strode and Gary Sinise, I mean, Russell Crowe, you'd be like, oh my God, like that sounds amazing. The reality is the movie's not necessarily amazing if you're a diehard Western fan, but it is worth watching, if only for the experiment of watching Sam Raimi stage many, many shootouts in a row. And these are not just like shootouts, these are like duels to the death. It's basically the whole premise of the movie is that there's this contest to see who's the fastest, the most accurate, the most deadly, etc. And as a filmmaker, that's a really interesting challenge where how many ways can you shoot just a duel to the death? And so while I'm not going to place this in the same league as a Western by someone like Anthony Mann or Sam Peckinpah or Bud Bedecker or John Ford or Howard Hawks or Sergio Leone or any of the other great Western directors, it is worth hunting down if you're a Raimi fan. It's definitely worth hunting down if you're a Gene Hackman fan. It's almost like Gene Hackman is acting like he's in a much more serious, grounded movie where everybody else is just kind of enjoying like the good pulpy fun. Because in the end, this movie could be with like martial arts, or it could be with lightsabers. It could be with anything. You just need to have a scenario where people are fighting to the death. But this is the beginning of Sam Raimi starting to shift into a more mainstream Hollywood stage of his career, where he's working with legit movie stars, bigger budgets, which would lead in 1998 to A Simple Plan. Now, a lot of people have forgotten about A Simple Plan because it's always kind of compared unfairly to Fargo, which came out a few years earlier, because obviously Joel Coen, Ethan Coen, and Sam Raimi, they're all friends, and both movies are kind of murder stories in frozen, wintry environments. But I rewatched A Simple Plan last night. I was floored. It's a really well done movie. Is it as good as Fargo? No, but Fargo is one of the best movies of the 1990s. But goddamn, A Simple Plan is a very effective, killer little ensemble movie where it becomes almost a comedy of errors of what happens when three knuckleheads find a shitload of money out in the woods and decide to keep it, which leads to all these unintended consequences and like a series of bad decisions that just keep escalating and escalating, where like the tension and the mutual suspicion continue to rise, and we have, you know, bloody shootouts and betrayal and murder and like legitimate gangsters. But at the core of all this mayhem, you have this beautiful relationship, which is portrayed by Bill Paxton and Billy Bob Thornton, who delivered two of their best performances ever. And Bill Paxton's one of those actors that we lost way too early. He gave us so many brilliant performances over the years, but this is one of his best. And he and Billy Bob Thornton, there's just something very sad and incredibly moving in the study of contrast, where one was clearly the favorite son, where the family invested in his education, whereas the other's kind of a lost soul who never really had a chance in life. And I'd been kind of sleeping on just how good this movie is the last 20, 25 years or so, but seeing it last night was a fresh reminder that A Simple Plan is by far one of Sam Raimi's best movies that he's ever made. Which is strange to say now, because after A Simple Plan, I don't know why, there's a couple year period where I started to kind of take a pass on Sam Raimi, because I liked the Sam Raimi, like the maniac who would go out into the woods with a camera and come back with a deranged movie. I didn't really want to see him go mainstream. And with his next two movies, I felt like he was, because For Love of the Game in 1999, I did not see when it came out. I didn't see it until a couple days ago. And it's more or less the movie that I feared it would be at that time, where it's this kind of overly long, bloated, sentimental love story amidst the backdrop of this legendary baseball player who's going into what might be the final game of his career. But it's from a novel by Michael Shara. And perhaps that was unfair to dismiss it at the time, because it is one of those kind of dad movies where it feels a little bit more like a movie directed by Kevin Reynolds or maybe Kevin Costner than a Sam Raimi movie. But I feel like Sam Raimi needed this movie to show that he could do a completely, totally mainstream movie where his filmmaking style would be almost invisible, and he could play with the big boys. And I think the movie might have been okay if it had been considerably shorter, but I think it's way too long, and it's filled with horrendous music with a lot of cover bands playing classics like Paint It Black. But it does have its moments of genuine, heartfelt emotion, and Kelly Preston's absolutely adorable in it. And you start to see actors like J.K. Simmons popping up, with whom Sam Raimi would work again and again and again, like in his next movie, The Gift from 2000. And The Gift is an interesting hybrid where you've got some ingredients that feel familiar to Sam Raimi fans, because you've got murder and the supernatural and that sort of thing. But it's definitely a much more mainstream movie with an enormous cast of superstars like Cate Blanchett and Keanu Reeves. And this is Keanu Reeves a year after The Matrix came out. And it's got Katie Holmes and Giovanni Ribisi and Rosemary Harris, who would also appear in the Spider-Man movies. But for me, it's an imperfect movie. As much as I like the premise, which is based on Billy Bob Thornton's own mother's reputed psychic abilities, I can't stand listening to this giant cast of wonderfully talented actors just doing awful Southern accents. Most of the cast in this movie can't do a Southern accent, and this is a very Southern story. But Katie Holmes looks like an absolute goddess in it, and she actually gets naked a few times. And we do have an appearance of Sam Raimi's car, the classic, the Delta 88 Oldsmobile, that has basically been around since the late 70s. And I think like almost none of the original car even like survives now, because every part's been replaced over time, but it still looks like the same old car. So I would say that The Gift is definitely second tier Sam Raimi But it's nothing compared to something that he would do later, like Drag Me to Hell in 2009. But for now, let's talk about his Spider-Man trilogy, which came out in 2002, 2004, and 2007. And the success of this trilogy played a large role in showing the commercial viability of the superhero genre in the 21st century. It changed the genre forever. These are beloved movies, or at least 1 and 2 are. Spider-Man 3 is a weird thing where people like how awful it is. It's one of those movies where it's like, it's so bad that it's one of those movies that people love to hate. But that didn't stop me from seeing it 3 times when it came out, even if I felt like it was a total embarrassment compared to Spider-Man 2. But as exciting as these movies might have been, I think what makes these movies so beloved is that they are just overflowing with heart. Tobey Maguire just imbued Peter Parker with so much heart, and I think that played a large role in the success of Spider-Man No Way Home. I mean, Spider-Man No Way Home is probably the biggest hit of the last couple of years, and it was a hit for a variety of reasons. Obviously, people loved the character Spider-Man, people loved the MCU, people loved the gimmick of having all the different Spider-Man appear in the same movie. But without the power of this original trilogy, I think you could shave a few $100 million off the box office of Spider-Man No Way Home. And I think the peak of this trilogy for me is that opening title sequence for Spider-Man 2, where you've got all these wonderful Alex Ross paintings summarizing the plot of the first movie, all while that Danny Elfman score just soars and soars and soars. And I can remember being in the theater in 2004, and just my arms are just covered in goosebumps. I was just overwhelmed with the stirring emotion. And for me, I divide superhero movies into different eras. And this is an era that's a pre-Dark Knight era. It's a pre-Iron Man era. It's pre-MCU era. And if you're going to talk about that pre-2008 era, yeah, this was the gold standard of superhero movies for a time. I mean, at one point, X-Men 2 and Spider-Man 2 were my 2 favorite superhero movies. They no longer occupy those slots. But it's incredible to me that this guy who, when he was a kid, ran off into the woods with his friends to make this mean and nasty, gnarly little horror movie that includes wildly inappropriate situations with a tree out in the woods, would not that many years later, 20 years later, be a complete and total industry player. And then Sam Raimi does something which you almost never see, where a director working with giant budgets decides to press pause on that career trajectory and go back and do a more modestly scaled movie, one that feels much more personal, one that feels like a return to form. Because I think Drag Me to Hell, people have kind of forgotten just how entertaining this movie is. Came out in 2009. It's nice and short. Alison Lohman just goes for it. She's totally game. And apparently she and Sam Raimi had a blast working together because she really enjoys doing her own stunts, at least when she's allowed to. And no matter how many times people were vomiting in her mouth or they were pouring maggots all over her, or whatever the case might be, she just was like more, more, more. And while I don't think Drag Me to Hell is scary at all, a lot of people, it's the scariest movie of Sam Raimi's career. I was like, when? Like, at no point is this movie scary at all. However, it's a blast, and I just laughed my ass off. Like when she's trying to pretend like she didn't just murder her cat earlier in the day, when somebody hears her talking about how she once had a cat versus saying, I have a cat. And there's so many wonderful, beautiful, gross little details, like an eyeball opening up in a slice of cake, or people coughing up flies, or flies going to people's noses while they sleep. And I think around the 2/3 mark, this movie does dip a bit, and it kind of gets into silly territory. But what redeems the movie is the completely, totally uncompromising, satisfying ending. I would say that the ending of this movie is just brilliant. I did not see it coming. And when it arrived, I was like, oh my God, I thought that they were going to chicken out and totally anyway, I thought they were going to give it the obligatory happy ending, and they just stuck the landing. So it's like the first hour is incredible, and like the last couple minutes is really good. But if you can start strong and end strong, people will forgive a lot in between. So I think Drag Me to Hell is easily one of Sam Raimi's finest films that he's ever created. But that is not the case with Sam Raimi's next movie, Oz the Great and Powerful from 2013, which is my least favorite Sam Raimi movie. I think James Franco's kind of lousy as the Wizard of Oz, and I had zero interest in seeing this when it came out. I had zero interest in watching it for this video, but I did. And pretty much everything I feared about it in advance turned out to be true. It's just bland, generic, lifeless, mainstream crap where you're taking a beloved franchise, The Wizard of Oz, and making some stupid prequel that's not even based on the books by the original authors, like loosely inspired by. But it's basically incredibly expensive fan fiction set in the world of Oz. And, I like seeing Mila Kunis show up, and she was just fine. And I enjoyed the opening, how it starts with like that 4:3 black and white, and then slowly but surely becomes this big widescreen spectacle. But goddamn, I just think this movie is lousy, and it doesn't have a single moment or scene that I like. So I'm just gonna move on, because contrary to popular opinion, Oz the Great and Powerful is not the last thing that Sam Raimi directed. He has directed a few things since that are fucking great, that are well worth hunting down. So let's start with Ash vs. Evil Dead, where he directed the pilot back in 2015. And I love this show. And it was so cool seeing Bruce Campbell really getting to finally deliver on more stories featuring Ash that we've been wanting for a long time. But also how they didn't compromise on the integrity of the character or the story. That first episode of Ash vs. Evil Dead, when he's getting dolled up and going to a bar and trying to get laid, and he's like, well, I'm like starting to get a little winded, like maybe you could do me for a while. It's one of those shows that made me like snort with laughter multiple times per episode. And the action in that first episode, Sam Raimi showed he still got it, like when Bruce Campbell's leaping through the air and putting his hand up into the chainsaw before going to work. Glorious stuff. If you're an Evil Dead fan and if you've never seen Ash vs. Evil Dead, definitely check out the entire show. But that first episode is particularly good. And lastly, I want to talk about something that I just saw this morning. I had no idea this even existed, but my entire life, I've been retelling the story or the ghost story of the Golden Arm. I've terrified my siblings. I've terrified my nieces and nephews. I love the ghost story of the Golden Arm. I always thought that it was a local legend from like Virginia and North Carolina. But according to the show 50 States of Fright from 2020, a show which is basically like reenactments or like cinematic portrayals of different legends from different states. According to Sam Raimi, it's a story from Michigan, because in 3 really tight short episodes that are between like 5 and 10 minutes long, Sam Raimi tells the story of the Golden Arm. And I don't know how I overlooked this at the time when it came out. Like if somebody told me, hey, Sam Raimi is about to adapt your all-time favorite ghost story into a really tight, economical 30-minute story, I'd be like, oh, you're joking. Like that, there's no way that could possibly be true. And even better, he did a really good job. Like I've been telling the ending differently than how he does it here. But that last episode, not only did it scare me, it scared me so bad that I yelled out loud twice while watching it. And it's when you're watching something on your iPad and you've only got a few minutes to get emotionally invested, it's a huge challenge for a director to get that kind of emotional response out of a viewer. But I was laughing and getting chills, and I was just delighted with the way they brought this to life. And it was great seeing the actor Travis Fimmel, who I love from Vikings, working with Sam Raimi. And who knows, maybe they'll work together again in the future, because in addition to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, there are some other projects that Sam Raimi's name is attached to, where in various stages of pre-production or announcement or whatever. I've never read the fantasy book, and apparently it's one of the best ever written, but the King Killer Chronicle, I think it's Patrick Rothfuss who wrote that. I'm going to read that. I wish they would go ahead and give that movie the green light, because then I'd be forced. I mean, it's a massive novel, and I think one of the reasons I've never read it is that I know it's a trilogy, and Patrick's been taking a long time to deliver the final book, and I've got too many fantasy series out there where authors have not finished, where it just tears your soul to pieces as you're waiting for these books. At any rate, if Sam Raimi ever officially goes into production on the King Killer Chronicle, I absolutely will read the first book in the series by Patrick Rothfuss. But also, there's a World War III project that Sam Raimi is attached to. I don't know anything about that, but it's based on a novel called The Next 100 Years. My hope is that Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is giant success, whether it's on the merits of the film or just people's love and adoration of the MCU. Also, the MCU, I mean, 2021 was a weird year for it, where there were so many new shows and movies set in the MCU, where I feel like the brand is getting diluted. It's becoming increasingly difficult to point to individual shows and movies by Marvel where you're like, that is everything I possibly want out of a superhero story. So for both the Sam Raimi fans out there like myself, as well as like the true diehard MCU fans, I really hope that Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is everything people are wanting it to be. While sometimes it's easy to hate on Marvel or to talk about how they've lost a step, a good movie-going experience is a win for everybody. So I will be there on day one, rooting for it to deliver. And fingers crossed, it creates opportunities where we see the Sam Raimi, the guy who did Drag Me to Hell, the guy who did Evil Dead 1, like some legit horrific stuff. Obviously, Marvel is a PG-13 kind of family-friendly brand, but we'll see what they allow him to get away with, because anybody who can deliver the success of the 3 Spider-Man movies clearly knows what he's doing. And so I think Marvel is used to dealing with less experienced directors and then turning them into experienced directors. The Russo Brothers. Prior to The Winter Soldier, the Russo Brothers were nobodies, but after making 4 giant hits for Marvel, they're industry players. And I think one of the reasons the MCU perhaps has suffered in the last year or two is that the Russo Brothers are playing over Netflix. But who knows? Maybe this movie will be such a big hit that Sam Raimi makes 2 or 3 more movies for the MCU. But we'll have to wait and see on May 6th when this movie comes out. But I think I've been talking enough at this point. Let's start editing this sucker together. So I can't thank you enough for listening to this lengthy, rambling, kind of aimless rant. Full disclosure, I'm doing this long video because I'm doing a recording in a studio next week with my friend Bill Scurry, and I just need some practice talking, just getting warmed up to kind of get my game face on. So I needed to do a more or less hands-free just rant. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified for future content. But I can't thank you enough for listening. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards. Or as Bruce Campbell would say, hail to the king, baby.